This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions yet.
Speaking of people making deals, there were 1915 was a very busy year, when things hadn't quite popped off yet in terms of Arabs uprising. But I'm just going to continue here about our friend Ibn Saud, who gets another. Again, this is written, before kind of Saudi Arabia was what it is today, right? Where Ibn Saud is almost, treated like this kind of two-bit, second tier kind of chieftain, like in Antonius's book. This is before the oil, really, the oil thing really popped up, before J. Paul Getty went over there. So he talks about the government of India, which is obviously part of the British Empire. He says they had been active in their field and looked upon the Arabian Peninsula as their special concern. It was Delhi, not London, that normally controlled the politics of Aden and its hinterland and of the Persian Gulf. And it was also Delhi that had directed the operations for the occupation of Basra in November 1914. Toward the end of the year, Captain J.R. Shakespeare of the Indian Political Service had been delegated on a mission to Ibn Saud to try to secure his cooperation in the cause of the Allies. Ibn Saud was not so well disposed towards the Turks as to need seducing, and just as Turkey was entering the war, a member of Al-Ad, the military secret society, deputed by Aziz Ali, had arrived at his capital to solicit his support for the nationalist cause and had been well received. At the same time, his role as chief of the Wahhabis placed him in a delicate position in regard to the Holy War and would have made it difficult for him to ignore it had the Grand Sharif endorsed the call. It was while Shakespeare was with him in January 1915 that emissaries arrived at Ibn Saud's court carrying a sounding message from Hussein. As related above, Ibn Saud had warmly supported the Sharif in his abstention from endorsing the call to jihad. He had also given Hussein to understand that, so far as Najd was concerned, the Turks would expect help in vain. To Shakespeare's overtures, he had returned a friendly answer, and before 1915 was out, he had concluded a treaty of alliance with the Viceroy of India. An agreement was also concluded by the government of India with the Idrisi in April. Like the subsequent treaty with Ibn Saud, this agreement related to local interests only, and neither instrument contained any reference to the broad issues of the Arab national movement. Nor was the Idrisi, any more than Ibn Saud, in a position to make a substantial military or moral contribution to the war against Turkey. The value of the agreements lay mainly in their negative results. They definitely shut out the prospect, at best a dim one, of an alliance between Turkey and the two chiefs, secured Ibn Saud's help in preventing supplies from reaching the enemy through the Persian Gulf, and made it no longer possible for the Turks to use the seaboard of Asir as a hostile base against Allied shipping in the Red Sea. Then, going back to the, Sharif Hussein, when he resumed negotiations with the British in July 1915, the war was going none too well for the Allies in the Near East. The operations in Gallipoli had been costly and unsuccessful. The Turkish attack on Egypt had been repulsed, but the threat remained and was immobilizing large forces. The Senussi chief's intentions were still obscure, but enough was known of his dealings with the Turks to cause uneasiness. And, as things turned out later in the year, the uneasiness was justified. The Sultan of Darfur, still in close touch with the Senussi, was showing signs of responding to the call of jihad. The Turkish forces in the Yaman had invaded the Aden Protectorate and, driving off the British troops sent to protect Lahaj, had moved to within a few miles of Aden. A brigade had to be hurriedly sent from Egypt to the rescue, except for the campaign in southern Iraq, where the advance northwards from Basra was making good progress against heavy odds. The British forces in the Arab world were everywhere on the defensive. It was while he was thus preoccupied with the dangers still threatening Egypt that Sir Henry McMahon received a note from the Sharif Hussein. Okay, so now we're on the chapter called Great Britain's Pledge, 1915, which is about the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. And like Antonius really zooms in on this because I think the Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration get like a lot of attention and not undeservedly so, but I think like you should kind of view them as like a trinity. Like this is the first really, really important one.
He has them like juxtaposed in his like appendix.
Yeah. So he goes on to describe this correspondence. He says that the Sharif's first note to Sir Henry McMahon was sent off about the middle of July and reached Cairo on an unspecified date in August, carried in the greatest secrecy by an emissary in the Sharif's confidence, Sheikh Muhammad Arif ibn Urafan. It bore no date, and as was customary in Arabia for prudence sake, no signature, but it was enclosed in a letter from Abdullah, addressed personally to Stores, and dated July 14th. The note stated the Arab terms for intervention. After a preamble stressing the determination of the Arab people to obtain their political independence and their belief in the reciprocity of British and Arab interests, it enumerated the conditions on which the Sharif was prepared, on behalf of the Arab people, to enter into an alliance with Britain for the attainment of that end. It stated that the proposal would remain open for 30 days and asked that an explicit acceptance or rejection be returned within that period. The conditions put forward on the basis on which an alliance would be acceptable to the Arabs were those of the Damascus Protocol, with the addition of one relating to the Caliphate, that, in the event of an Arab caliph being proclaimed, Great Britain would accord him recognition. There was also an addendum stipulating that the clauses relating to mutual assistance were to remain valid for 15 years or longer if desired by both parties. Except for those two additions, the terms proposed in the note were those of the Damascus Protocol, of which the first clause, that relating to the boundaries of the independent Arab territory, had been textually embodied in the note. In his preamble, the Sharif explained that, as time pressed, the Arabs had thought it preferable to confine themselves to fundamental questions and to postpone the discussion of secondary matters to a more leisurely occasion. In his letter to Stores, Abdullah did not discuss the conditions contained in his father's note, but requested its transmission to the proper quarter, and suggested that, since the Arabs had made up their minds, there was no need to continue the distribution of propaganda leaflets in Arabia. He stressed the importance of care and secrecy in the exchange of correspondence. His only concrete demand related to the presence of grain, which Egypt donated annually on the occasion of the pilgrimage, out of charitable endowments for distribution among the poor in Mecca and Medina. The war had caused an interruption of the pilgrimage from Egypt, and Abdullah urged that the bounties, which went customarily with it, be dispatched by some appropriate means to the Hejaz, where they could make more satisfying propaganda than leaflets. So, Sir Henry McMahon's reply, dated August 30th, is a curious example of official evasiveness. Acting presumably on instructions from the Foreign Office, he abstained from saying either yes or no. He reiterated the general assurances previously given to the Sharif in Lord Kitchener's name, both as regards Arab independence and the Arab Caliphate. But when it came to specifying the meaning of those assurances and in defining the area of that Arab independence, he declared that a discussion seemed to him inopportune because, he argued, it appeared a waste of time to discuss such things under the stress of war, and even more naively, because the Turks were still in occupation of portions of the Arab countries. And this in reply to a proposal occasioned by the stress of war, and of which the point was that its adoption would enable the Arabs to rise and help the Allies to put an end to the Turkish occupation! ! So a third reason he gave, and it is perhaps the most astonishing of the three, was that certain Arab subjects of the Sultan, in regions still held by the Turks, were serving in the armies of the Sultan. He concluded his note with a declaration of his readiness to dispatch the Egyptian bounties of grain for the poor. So Antonius says, the note makes foolish reading, not only on account of its palpable insincerity, but also because it tried to reconcile two irreconcilables, to win the Sharif over to an effective alliance, and at the same time deny him the only means by which he could make that alliance effective. Its inconsistency is largely to be accounted for by the fact that, even at that stage, McMahon and his advisors were still very imperfectly acquainted with the underground forces at work. They had not been informed of the tenor of Faisal's conversations in Damascus, knew nothing of al-Fatat, and had only the vaguest inkling of the existence of al-Ad. They believed that the Sharif Hussein was speaking for himself and perhaps working for his own ends, and that he could be won over by a promise to recognize him as caliph and by an undefined prospect of Arab independence. Knowledge was to come to them accidentally a month later, but at the end of August they had not the remotest idea of what lay behind the Sharif's proposal. McMahon's first note, like all his subsequent ones, was in Arabic. The text of each note had, of course, been drawn up in English and then translated at the British Agency and issued in Arabic, and the quotations which appear in this narrative, as well as the text printed in the appendix, are from my own rendering of the Arabic version. The style varies from one note to the other, as though a different translator had been employed on each, but they all reveal their English origin unmistakably, save for the array of fulsome compliments and honorifics that are not English or Arabic, but a medley of Turko-Persian toadyisms, which someone on McMahon's staff had thought appropriate. He really goes in on the cringe style of this flummery served only to annoy Hussein, who showed his irritation in his reply. In every way, McMahon's note on August 30th was bound to be distasteful to Hussein. The Sharif wrote back very promptly on September 9th and is much longer than the first. Hussein's style, too, had its peculiarities. His notes to McMahon were all composed by himself in that cumbrous idiom of Turkish-ridden Arabic, which he had acquired in Constantinople, Istanbul, in the Hamidian days, when it was often safer for a man, if he had to speak his mind, to speak it unintelligibly. He does not like this Turko-Arabic.
No, he does not. As if Arabic isn't florid, diplomatic or poetic Arabic isn't also incredibly florid. I guess it just contains Turkish words. That's his problem.
Yeah, he definitely has a problem of it. Yeah, 223. Yeah, this is where he shits on it. Yeah, he says in the notes that Hussein sent to Cairo, he alternates between terseness and complexity, and although his meaning is always unmistakable, it often lies hidden under a jungle of verbal creepers and has to be patiently disentangled, a task which, difficult enough when one reads him, must make the despair of translators.
This honestly sounds like Orientalism. I feel like I've heard a million Orientalists say this about just Arabic in general. But
yeah. He does have this funny part here where he says he is irritated with McMahon for harping on the caliphate as though it were all that mattered, and blurts out that he regards it as a dead institution. And in the same paragraph gives McMahon, right? See, the Westerners care about it kind of way more.
Well, yeah, because they have this
with
cartoony image of the political reality. It's not
that
if
we just offer him the caliphate, he'll totally accept.
They not really they would agree with the Germans where it's the power of the caliphate that. Meanwhile, if they were paying attention over the last decade or so, they would have seen the incredible damage to the idea of the caliphate that was suffered in the Young Turk Revolution and all that stuff and everything that preceded as well, and just the war itself. But anyway,
He also says that in the same paragraph, Hussein gives McMahon a little rap on account of his lavish use of titles and compliments. This is a quote from Sharif Hussein in the letter. For our aim, O respected minister, is to ensure that the conditions which are essential to our future shall be secured on a foundation of reality and not on highly decorated phrases and tides. So, oh, respected minister. Yeah, he's trolling him there a little bit. And he makes it clear in this letter that the question of frontiers must be treated as fundamental, and the issue of his negotiation with McMahon, quote, depends solely upon whether you will reject or admit the proposed frontiers of an independent Arab state. So basically that put the question to McMahon that it's time for him to say yes or no to this kind of proposal. But he's been, mealy-mouthed about it so far and kind of trying to slither out of it.
Yeah, this is perception that, I feel like Antonius is fixated on the Turkic elements of it, but I think that it's just this kind of, it is the same European perception of Arabic and Persian being and I guess Islamicate languages or like Islamic diplomatic decorum as being like incredibly like just florid and verbose and like full of platitudes. So he's like trying to replicate that, and it's just like shut the fuck up, like
I guess what Antonius would say, the typical Arab bluntness kind of cuts through.
Yeah, I guess so. Even though, again, I feel like his idea of like the typical, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree that like Arabs are blunt, but at the same time, I feel like, of course, almost all diplomacy, I would say, is like kind of florid. I certainly wouldn't say that it's unique.
I maybe take it as the way often cultures are juxtaposed, where like they're like the British are on one far the end of just like the propriety spectrum, and then like the Arabs are more like the cut through the bullshit, man. Like like let's be real, kind of like a little more not playing these little like word game kind of. But I mean, at the same time, like he was familiar with it.
Yeah, I feel like there's two sides to like all these stereotypes about this particular thing. Like I feel like there's a stereotype about everyone. They never say what they mean, and also a stereotype that they like are straight shooters. Like any given like ethnicity you can think of, there's a stereotype that they're straight shooters, and a stereotype that they like are crafty and lie and like or
that's true. I feel like I've definitely heard like people talk like British like bluntness has been kind of like pointed out by people in like certain kind of way. Maybe it's a class thing, but like it's definitely. Like
British.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Mean. Like there's a two-sidedness. There's two wolves fighting inside every ethno-linguistic tradition.
when it comes to this issue of like whether you're blunt or like a
crafty.
or
I mean, you
whatever,
could absolutely say the same thing about Americans, like specifically Americans that like were very like blunt and direct and loud and like literal, but also like we're like the PR shyster like. Kind of used car salesman, like par excellence of the world. So, like, we have both going on. Yeah. So, all right. So then, after
this battle of ethnic essentialism is coming out here, but
it rages. So in the midst of these first exchanges, there's a little bit of like a spy intrigue because a young Arab officer in the Turkish army had arrived in Cairo early in October, a POW from the Gallipoli front. He had deliberately crossed over to the British lines and, stating that he had important intelligence to disclose, had surrendered and asked to be taken to Egypt. He turned out to be a member of Al-Ad, and a keen worker in the cause of Arab emancipation. He was a Muslim from Iraq, and his name was Muhammad Sharif al-Faruqi. The information disclosed by Faruqi had a decisive influence on the attitude of McMahon and his advisors. He was not, in fact, an accredited emissary of Al-Ad, but he was well acquainted with the organization and the aims of the society and those of Al-Fatah, its civilian sister, and had a good deal to say on the sentiments animating their members. His statements were carefully sifted and checked, and passed the test so well that he came to be regarded not only as a sincere and well-intentioned informer, which he undoubtedly was, but also the authorized spokesman of Al-Ad and Al-Fatah, which it was afterwards discovered he was not. However, his knowledge was reliable so far as it went, and he told the authorities much that was new to them about the real state of feeling among Arab nationalists in Syria and Iraq. So that when Sharif's second note arrived, McMahon and his advisors had enough knowledge of the background to read it with a fuller understanding. So the note which McMahon dispatched in reply is by far the most important in the whole correspondence, and may perhaps be regarded as the most important international document in the history of the Arab national movement. It contains the pledges which brought Arabs into the war openly on the side of the Allies. In the years that followed the war, it became an outstanding bone of contention, and down to the present day is still invoked as the main piece of evidence on which the Arabs accuse Great Britain of having broken faith with them. So here we go. Let's go. It's betrayal time. So this note is dated October 24th, 1915. In it, McMahon begins by assuring the Sharif that his previous unwillingness to discuss frontiers meant only that he did not think the time had come yet for discussing such a subject conclusively, but that, since the Sharif had represented the matter as fundamental and urgent, he, McMahon, had been authorized by the British government to give on their behalf certain assurances to the Arabs. He went on to state what those assurances were. They amounted to a pledge on Great Britain's part to recognize and uphold the independence of the Arabs in the area contained within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif, with the exception of certain parts of Asia Minor and of Syria. A reservation was also made in regard to those territories within the same area in which Great Britain was in treaty relations with various Arab chiefs. The paragraphs in McMahon's note, which define the pledge and its accompanying reservations, ran as follows, quote, "The districts of Mersin and Alexandretta and portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo cannot be said to be purely Arab and must on that account be excepted from the proposed delimitation. Subject to that modification, and without prejudice to the treaties concluded between us and certain Arab chiefs, we accept that delimitation. As for the regions lying within the proposed frontiers, in which Great Britain is free to act without detriment to the interests of her ally France, I am authorized to give you the following pledges on behalf of the government of Great Britain, and to reply as follows to your note," quote, in diplomatic all caps, "that, subject to the modifications stated above, Great Britain is prepared to recognize and uphold the independence of the Arabs in all of the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca," end quote. The note contains 4 other stipulations on questions other than that of frontiers. In the first, Great Britain guarantees that the holy places shall be secured against external aggression. In the second, she expresses her readiness to assist the Arabs in the setting up of suitable systems of administration in the area of future Arab independence. The third stipulates that Arabs shall have recourse to England only for the recruitment of foreign advisors and officials they might need. The fourth provides that, in view of Great Britain's special interests in Iraq, the oil, a particular form of administration will have to be devised for the provinces of Basra and Baghdad on a basis which is unspecified, but which implies a measure of Anglo-Arab partnership in that part of the independent Arab state. In his concluding paragraphs, McMahon expresses the hope that these assurances will result in a lasting alliance between Great Britain and the Arabs, and that an early result of the alliance will be the expulsion of the Turks from the Arab countries and the liberation of the Arab peoples. He abstains from making any reference to the question of the caliphate, which Hussein had testily brushed aside. But, in spite of the Sharif's tart remark about titles and compliments, he goes on showering them by the bucketful incorrigibly. Yeah, he says the reply which the Sharif returned in answer to McMahon's second note shows him at his best as a far-sighted diplomat and at his worst as a writer of dispatches. 2 or 3 of its paragraphs almost defy translation. Damn. One of them, that which relates to the provinces of Iraq, is a long, prickly affair of clauses and subclauses, dashes and digressions growing out of each other like the expansions of a cactus plant, and must be read over and over again, and with faith in its author's lucidity before the sense can be unraveled. Once this is done, the sentence loses its terrors, and the meaning emerges all the richer from the complexity of its texture. This third note of the
I would
Sharif,
like to read this.
Yeah, I know. What is this confusing, like...
I would like to see the Arabic of this.
I wonder if
he's
it's in
really
the,
talking it up.
I know. It's really hyping
Is it in
here.
the
It sounds like a
appendices?
Kamala speech.
Does he have the Arabic in the appendices?
Yeah, well, he has certain things in the appendices, but I don't know if he... You're right. I don't know if he has
have it in Arabic or just
the
in
original Arabic.
translation?
Probably
Yeah, let me
not.
look.
You'd probably have to look it up.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's somewhere. It might be somewhere because it was circulated a lot in Arabic first. Okay, the third note from Sharif Hussein is the 5th of November. He begins by defining his attitude on the question of the frontiers. He consents at once to the exclusion of the Vilayat of Adana, which included the port of Mersin, from the area of Arab independence, but he refuses to accept the exclusion of, quote, portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, on the ground that, unlike Mersin and Adana, they were purely Arab regions, nor does he admit the exclusion of Alexandretta. He accepts the reservation about those Arab chiefs with whom Great Britain had treaties, but in such terms as to make it appear possible that his concurrence applied only to chiefs in the neighborhood of Basra. With regard to the proposed Anglo-Arab partnership in the provinces of Iraq, he does not accept McMahon's proposal in its entirety, but consents to a British post-war occupation of those parts of Iraq which were then, November 1915, in British hands, on the understanding that the occupation would be temporary, that it would not be regarded as implying any alienation of Arab territory, and that in return a subsidy to be agreed upon should be paid by Great Britain to the future Arab state as a contribution towards its budgetary resources in the years of its infancy. The outstanding divergence, then, was still on the question of frontiers, and it related to the coastal regions of northern Syria. In consenting to the exclusion of the Vilayat of Adana, The Sharif had conceded more and less than McMahon had asked. What McMahon had asked was the exclusion of the districts of Mersin and Alexandretta. The Sharif had agreed to Mersin and had volunteered the exclusion of the entire Vilayat of Adana into the bargain, but he had not consented to the exclusion of Alexandretta, which lay in the Vilayat of Aleppo, any more than he would accept McMahon's reservation of any other part of Syria. And then he brings up the fear of, like, he wants a guarantee that if they're at a future peace conference, that they will be treated as formal belligerents and not informal belligerents. So they'll have like a seat at the table, and basically that, and wants a promise that Great Britain would stand by them and advocate their case in the peace negotiations. He's unwilling to proclaim the revolt at once without some further preparation, but in any case, he must have those guarantees before he can make any move at all. So then the British reply to that took some time in coming, comes on December 13th, and apparently oscillates between vagueness and precision. McMahon agrees to the exclusion of the Vilayat of Adana, but maintains his reservation of the coastal regions of northern Syria, no longer on the plea that they were not purely Arab, but solely on the ground that French interests were involved. On the subject of existing treaties with Arab chiefs, he notifies the Sharif that his acquiescence is taken to apply to the Arabian Peninsula as well as to Iraq. But when he comes to deal with Hussein's specific proposal for Anglo-Arab partnership in the future administration of portions of Iraq, he becomes vague and in studiedly diffuse phrases tells Hussein that the proper safeguarding of British interests would necessitate some such agreement as he had outlined, but that it called for more detailed consideration than was possible at the time. And they end with a kind of tentative, okay, like McMahon emphasizes that he reassures him that Great Britain would not conclude peace on any terms that did not provide for, quote, the freedom of the Arab peoples. So then the next note comes in early January 1st, 1916. By that time, Farouki, the defector, had gotten in touch, I think, with Hussein and told him about what he had told McMahon. He begins his note by expressing his satisfaction at hearing that Farouki's evidence had borne out all that Hussein had said. They talk a little bit more vaguely about Iraq. Then they talk about the coastal regions of northern Syria, and it's clear that he finds himself in a dilemma. So, like, he's anxious to clinch a negotiation, which had been going on since October 1914, to begin active preparations for the revolt. But on the other hand, the proposal to exclude any part of Syria from the area of Arab independence was one on which he was not at liberty to compromise, let alone to yield. His way out of the dilemma is neither a compromise nor an acquiescence, but a postponement. He tells McMahon that he is anxious to avoid disturbing the concord between France and Great Britain, and that he will therefore shelve the matter for the duration of the war. But he gives him in the plainest language to understand that it will remain out of the question that France or any other power should be conceded, quote, a single square foot of territory in those parts, and that he would seize the earliest opportunity after the conclusion of the war to vindicate the Arab claim to the whole of Syria. He does not ask for an answer to any of his observations, but writes as one who considers that the bargain is concluded, and the note ends with a reiteration of his resolve to proclaim a revolt at the earliest moment, and with an intimation that he would inform McMahon in due course of his requirements in arms, ammunition, and supplies. So this is kind of Antonius is editorializing here, but he says that Hussein's willingness to postpone the question of the coastal regions of northern Syria may seem inconsistent with his former insistence on a prompt and full acquiescence in his terms in advance. The explanation is a psychological one. It lies in the profound belief he had in British integrity, a belief widely held in the Arab world at the time. In the years he had spent in Istanbul, he had watched the moves on the diplomatic chessboard with a detached and critical eye, and had become attracted to the representatives of Great Britain as being the cleanest players in the game. He had entered into cordial relations with the British embassy, so far as prudence allowed, and had encountered friendliness and an absence of guile which, to one living in the atmosphere of Hamidian tortuosity, must have seemed to pertain to the realm of the supernatural, and he had learned that his elevation to the Grand Sharifate in 1908 had England's secret backing. This combination of admiration and gratitude had begotten in him a deep regard for certain individual Englishmen and a solid belief in English standards of honorable dealing. Having secured McMahon's positive assurances on the fundamental question of the area of Arab independence, he was willing to let secondary definitions bide their time, and he had such faith in the strength of the Arab claim to the whole of Syria and in the fairness with which Great Britain would deal with it in due time that he confidently left the question of France's interest in the coastal regions, together with the arrangements to be made for the administration of Iraq, remain over for future settlement. No. Big mistake, man. Big mistake. Ugh. You hate to see it.
Yeah.
Because that ends up being a very bad read on English intentions, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like McMahon liked this approach by Sharif that, you know, let's shelve the Syria issue for a little while. But he does hint that it would be vain to expect a relaxation of Anglo-French solidarity after the war. The hint appears to have been intended to mean, in effect, that in the event of France maintaining her claims, Great Britain could not hold out any guarantee that those portions of Syria, which had been accepted from the Arab area in the earlier note, would be included in the territories in which she had pledged herself to recognize and uphold Arab independence. So then, at that point, the negotiations came to a close, and both sides regarded the bargain as concluded. And after that, it was really more practical notes about the preparations of the revolt rather than the terms to be agreed upon. So, I mean, that is like the seed of the British-Arab alliance, essentially, that plots the Arab revolt, which finally does pop off in June 1916. Antonius just has a couple more notes like about these correspondences and like their significance, especially about Palestine. He says it should be noted at the outset that Sir Henry McMahon never defines in his own words the area of Arab independence. What he does is to accept en bloc, save for certain reservations, the frontiers proposed by the Sharif Hussein. It follows, therefore, that unless Palestine or any other part of the area defined by the Sharif was specifically mentioned in the reservations, it must be held to have formed part of the territory accepted by Great Britain as the area of Arab independence. The first point that strikes one is that nowhere in the text before us is there any mention of Palestine. While certain portions of the Arab area are specifically, if somewhat loosely, singled out as calling for special treatment, no mention is made anywhere of that part of Syria which was known, in Ottoman administrative parlance, as the Sanjak of Jerusalem. The territory of Palestine and its present frontiers is made up of the former Sanjak of Jerusalem, with the addition of a portion of the former Vilayat of Beirut, which was contiguous with it. And the fact that Sir Henry McMahon, who is at pains throughout the correspondence to enumerate by name each of the provinces affected by his reservations, does not mention the Sanjak of Jerusalem, even indirectly, disposes at once of the legend that the present territory of Palestine was specifically excluded from the area in which Great Britain pledged herself to recognize and uphold an independent Arab government. The British government's contention is that Palestine was excluded by implication when Sir Henry McMahon notified the Sharif that, quote, portions of Syria lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo were to be excluded from the area of Arab independence. This contention was publicly sponsored by who else? Mr. Winston Churchill in 1922, when speaking as a responsible minister of the Crown. He tried to argue that the word districts in that phrase was to be read as equivalent to vilayats, and that since the Vilayat of Damascus included that part of Syria now known as Transjordan, which lay to the east of the River Jordan, it followed that that part of Syria, now known as Palestine, which lay to the west of the Jordan, was one of the portions of territory reserved in Sir Henry McMahon's phrase. Very clever, right? Yeah. So by like extending the depth, by like, yeah, of course, but as he says, an examination of the text shows that the British government's argument is untenable. In the first place, the word districts in Sir Henry McMahon's phrase could not have been intended as the equivalent of vilayats because there were no such things as the Vilayat of Damascus, the Vilayat of Homs, and the Vilayat of Hama. There was one single vilayat of Syria, of which Damascus was the capital, and two smaller administrative divisions, of which Homs and Hama were the principal towns. Sir Henry McMahon's phrase can only make sense if we take his districts as meaning districts in the current use of the word, that is to say, the regions adjacent to the four cities, and his reservation as applying to that part of Syria, roughly from Sidon to Alexandretta, which lies to the west of the continuous line formed by those four cities and the districts immediately adjoining them. Two parallels will serve to show the absurdity of the attempts made to put a different interpretation on that phrase. If it had run, the districts of Lincoln, Gainsborough, Doncaster, and York, no one would interpret the word districts as meaning counties, or the area covered by the phrase as embracing the entire counties of Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, or supposing that the phrase had said, the districts of New York, Newark, New Brunswick, and Trenton, would anyone read the word districts as equivalent to states, and the phrase as covering the entire states of New York and New Jersey?
Funny.
Yet that is precisely what the British government tried to plead in their unconvincing attempt to justify the exclusion of Palestine from the area of Arab independence. Again, in his third note, dated December 13th, Sir Henry McMahon refers to the regions which he wished to exclude as being in, quote, the two vilayats of Aleppo and Beirut. Had he had Palestine in mind, he would certainly have added, and the Sanjak of Jerusalem. The fact that he did not goes to confirm the conclusion that the only portions of Syria which it was proposed at the time to reserve in favor of France were the coastal regions of northern Syria. Lastly, in giving the pledge contained in a second note, McMahon stated that Great Britain recognized as the area of Arab independence all the regions lying within the frontiers proposed by the Sharif of Mecca, in which she was, quote, free to act without detriment to the interests of her ally France. Both in that note and his subsequent one on December 13th, he justified his exclusion of certain parts of Syria on the grounds of Great Britain's regard for French interests. If, then, Great Britain were to find herself at the end of the war free to act in respect to any portion of Syria which she had felt bound to reserve in favor of France, the reservation loses its justification and indeed whatever force it may have had when it was originally made, and that portion of Syria which was no longer destined to be included in the sphere of French interests, as was eventually the case with Palestine, must, in default of any specific agreement to the contrary, necessarily remain within the area of Arab independence proposed by the Sharif and accepted by Great Britain. And he goes on to say that, like, they've suppressed the documents, basically, because the controversy is still going on in the 30s, and eminent people in and out of government circles are still loudly maintaining, in some cases quite genuinely, that Palestine was in fact excluded by McMahon from the area of Arab independence. No one who has had the text of the McMahon Correspondence before him can legitimately hold such a view, and it is only because the full text has not hitherto been available in any language other than Arabic that such an untenable contention could with impunity be advanced. Although they were repeatedly pressed to issue an authoritative English version, successive British governments have refused to publish the full text on the plea that it would be contrary to the public interest to disclose it. The plea might have had some force had the notes exchanged between the Sharif Hussein and McMahon not been available in any form, and had their contents remained a real as well as an official secret. In actual fact, the terms of the McMahon Correspondence are known all over the Arab world. Extracts have from time to time been officially published in Mecca by Sharif Hussein himself, and several of the notes have appeared verbatim and in full in Arabic books and newspapers. It is open to any person with a knowledge of Arabic who can obtain access to the files of defunct Arabic newspapers to piece the whole of the McMahon notes together, and that work I have done in 4 years of travel and research from Cairo to Baghdad and from Aleppo to Jeddah. What the British government had in mind when they invoked the public interest as their justification for refusing to publish the McMahon Correspondence remains a mystery. I have felt bound in the course of my researches to investigate that aspect of the problem before assuming the responsibilities implied in my duty as a historian. But by the time I had collated the available versions of the McMahon notes and drawn up the full and final text, it became manifest that there was nothing in the correspondence that was not already a matter of public knowledge throughout the Arab world. It also became apparent that the British government's interpretation of the meaning and scope of their own pledges was inconsistent with both the letter and the spirit of the texts. It seemed a matter of public duty to make the Arabic text known. For this reason, if no other, that the divergence between the British and Arab interpretations of the pledges has been the underlying cause of a great deal of avoidable waste, suffering, and bloodshed already, and will continue to cause waste, suffering, and bloodshed in the future so long as the present misunderstanding remains. Far from its being contrary to the public interest, the publication of the texts is urgently needed in the interests of all parties concerned, and the Royal Commission on Palestine have already set the example by reproducing the whole of McMahon's note of October 24th, 1915, in Chapter 2 of the report. I guess he mentions that even British officials have actually come out and said that they should release the documents, basically. One of them was the late Sir Edward Grey, Viscount Grey of Falodon, whose opinion should carry more weight, perhaps, than that of any other statesman, since he was the responsible minister on whose instructions the McMahon Notes were issued. Speaking in the House of Lords in 1923, he said, "A considerable number of these engagements, or some of them, which have not been officially made public by the government, have become public through other sources. Whether all have become public, I do not know, but I seriously suggest to the government that the best way of clearing our honor in this matter is officially to publish the whole of the engagements relating to the matter, which we entered into during the war. I am sure that we cannot redeem our honor by covering up our engagements and pretending there is no inconsistency, if there really is inconsistency. I am sure that the most honorable course will be to let it be known what the engagements are, and, if there is inconsistency, then to admit it frankly, and admitting that fact, and having enabled people to judge exactly what is the amount of the inconsistency, to consider what is the most fair and honorable way out of the impasse into which the engagements may have led us." He says these are the words of the very statesman who, as Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, was responsible for the engagements made in the McMahon Correspondence. Similar views were expressed by the late Earl of Oxford and by Mr. Lloyd George in a debate in the House of Commons in March 1923, when the two veteran statesmen vied with each other in pressing the Prime Minister of the day to make the documents public. Other public figures representing each of the different political parties have from time to time added their voices to those of Grey, Asquith, and Lloyd George. Then he says that the idea of carrying out the necessary research to piece together this correspondence was suggested to Antonius in 1931 by the late King Hussein in Amman a few months before his death, which I guess he used to be reticent about it, but in his old age was loquacious in his eagerness to make the whole truth known. He showed Antonius the original drafts of his notes to McMahon and allowed him to examine and copy them out while he looked on in silence, breaking it only to answer my questions. I can never forget him as he sat there, ill at ease, in an armchair far too large for his small frame, shrunken with paralysis, his beautiful face blanched by the pallor of death, his eyes suddenly glowing from the vacancy of resignation to flashes of controlled passion. He was as alert and lucid as when I had first seen him at the height of his vigor 7 years previously. But this time, his mind seemed less flexible, and the mannerisms of expression, which were a feature of his conversation, obtruded themselves with greater frequency, as though habit had begun to steal upon reasoning. His old craving for self-justification had become an obsession. As he pressed me to write the story of the Arab revolt, he would point to the papers before me and say, quote, "Here are the premises of our revolt, and my justification. I say my justification." The phrase may have recurred as often as 8 or 10 times in the course of my first hour with him. By this time, 1931, he had been in exile for 6 years. He had lost his throne and been forced out of his country, in circumstances which will be related presently, and was now a sick old man, anxious only to explain himself. In his bitterness, he ascribed all his misfortunes to the non-fulfillment of the promises made to him by Sir Henry McMahon, which he plaintively represented as the sole cause of his present plight. He kept mentioning Kitchener, whom he had never met, but only to lament his death, and spoke scathingly of Lloyd George, as though Mr. Lloyd George had been the villain of the piece, and his strictures lost none of their force for being clad in the comic finery of Hamidian etiquette. Quote, "The English,
this
my
guy
son."
really hates Hamidian etiquette. Anyway,
he hates it. This is what Hussein said: "The English, my son, are an honorable kind in word and in deed, in fortune and in adversity. I say honorable. Only His Excellency, the estimable, energetic Louis George, is something of an acrobat and a fox. I say a fox, saving your presence. God have mercy on the soul of His Excellency Kitchener." at the end of the chapter. Yeah,
nice.
so I mean, you could still see even as he blamed McMahon and the British for how everything went down, he's still like, oh, but the British are honorable people. Like, he just trusted them a little bit too much, I guess.
I would say
And that brings us to the Arab.
He probably had like kind of some friendships with them, or felt that, so I don't know. I mean, it's possible that there was some Charlie Wilson's war type shit going on, like on some level, where there were some who maybe didn't envision it going that way, like within, the British operation. But it seems like think about what Sykes said, think about all the sentiments they're constantly expressing in private. They don't actually want Arabs to have any kind of independence.
No.
Not when there's alternatives.
That's why maybe you have to send in a swashbuckling romantic figure who is almost as a bit fanatically devoted to Arab independence, but is so cloaked in Edwardian irony that it's hard to tell if he really means it.
I mean, it's just amazing to believe that he could be so naive to still have a fond impression of those people, or that they could be such cunning and adroit manipulators that he could walk away with a
respect for them.
Yeah, it's just.
Louis Georges was a fox, but the rest of them were honorable.
I could see there being some people like that genuinely believe that they're a Charlie Wilson war hero guy, and they really think we're trying to help, we're abandoning them, et cetera, et cetera. They really buy their own bullshit. And that's the only way that I could see, but I don't think that Kitchener was such a person, No, I don't think so.
Yeah. I think maybe T.E. Lawrence was for a while he was in it. He psyoped himself into going method acting and really kind of, going full Bedouin. But hold on, I just want to grab a little more coffee and water, and then we'll talk about the revolt itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could. Yeah, I think we should talk a little bit about the outbreak of the war, and the reality on the ground, in Palestine. I think there's a little bit more that could be.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. For example.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on.
I just wanted to like take up a little bit where I left off and talk about what the situation on the ground was like in Palestine, like at the outbreak of this war, because I feel like these on the ground perspective, and they kind of witness like these diaries that this guy collects. They really like witness the outbreak of this revolt and they like respond to it in real time. Like, you know, we won't go through like the whole diaries, but the discussion of them is pretty interesting. And there are like some selections that I think are trenchant as like historical testimony. Anyway, so wrapping up his discussion of Rifki and Cemal Pasha, he says, Rifki does not shed light on Cemal's presumed strategy of building an Arab-Turkish federation to replace a disintegrating Ottoman regime, as suggested by some Arab thinkers like Omar Saleh. But he makes clear in his memoirs that Cemal's failure was a defeat for any future Turkish Arab dominion. Rifki recounts the bitterness of seeing his commander replaced in supreme command by General von Falkenhayn.
No.
Cemal Pasha was unwilling to give up his Syrian dream. He wanted to return to Istanbul at the end of the war, bearing the gift of Assyria preserved. Perhaps he took advantage of his weakness for pomp and circumstance. He was appointed commanding general of Syria and Western Arabia, a sort of commander-in-chief, second class to von Falkenhayn. It wasn't Cemal Pasha that was failing. It was the province of Syria. But because it was a country with an excessive regard for rank decorations and gold braid, it fell not as Anatolian villages fall, in silence and loneliness, but more showily and magnificently, wrapped in the uniforms of commanders-in-chief, marshals, and ministers. Yeah. In the introduction to his memoirs, Zeytindagi, Mount of Olives, Fala Rifki refers emblematically to this problem of Turkish identity in Palestine. Olberg is the German term for Mount of Olives. Jabal-i-Zaytun is the Arabic. And Zeytindagi is just the name I gave to my book. There never was a Turkish Jerusalem. But of course there was an Ottoman Jerusalem. Rifki was resisting identifying. Then there's this section called The End of Innocence, which I think is great.
This is the end of the innocence.
Yeah.
Don Henley.
Yeah, exactly. This is what Don Henley wrote that song about.
Wow.
Yeah. Ihsan Turjman's diary is a long-sustained attack on the ethos of war. His stance is born not so much from an ideology of pacifism as from revulsion against the war-induced social disintegration and loss of the earlier era of stability, conditions that he attributed to the megalomania of the new Ottoman leadership. The new politics of nationalist aggrandizement, ethnic oppression, and carnage brought an irrational and incoherent world. It produced what John Berger called the inversion of politics. As in the European front, in Belgium, in France, and the Dardanelles, the impact of the war was seen as catastrophe, and people felt they had lost control over the future. With the earlier debate about the future of Palestine, we witnessed a sense of disorientation and a decentering from old certainties. The impending loss of empire created a sense of geographic fragmentation. According to John Berger, under these conditions of alienation, which were very similar to the situation in the Levant, nobody realized how far-reaching would be the effects of the coming inversion of politics. That is to say, the predominance of ideology over politics. This was also the case with the European War, which ended the age of political innocence. Soon such innocence ceased to be justified. Too much evidence had to be denied to maintain it, notably the conduct of the First World War, not its mere outbreak, and the widespread popular acquiescence in it. What in fact happened is that most people remained politically innocent at the price of denying experience. And this in itself contributed further to the political ideological inversion. We can see this spread of popular acquiescence recorded in Ihsan's daily impressions about the progression of the war. Indeed, the world was disintegrating around him. The large-scale military impounding of grain from the peasants led to skyrocketing food prices in the city, followed by the disappearance of vegetables and meat. Women and children, most young men were already conscripted, formed long queues in front of bakeries and fought for meager amounts of bread. famine struck, I guess this guy left out an S. That's actually his fault for once. Famine struck every major town in Syria, Palestine, and Mount Lebanon. And Isan notes it was man-made, caused initially by the British economic blockade of the Palestine coast and later by military sequestration of food, not by scarcity.
Okay. They just did another Holodomor along the way.
Yeah, they're just Holodomors everywhere.
Left
yeah,
and right. Wow.
They're just pockets are overflowing with Holodomors everywhere. Yeah, it's like... In Lebanon, the famine was compounded by economic sanctions imposed by Cemal Pasha to punish nationalist leaders for their presumed collaboration with the French authorities. By the summer of 1915, the Locust attack reached Jerusalem, followed by the spread of cholera, typhus, and other epidemics. Beggars began to appear everywhere. This part's kind of interesting in light of what we talked about in past parts. The graphic descriptions of beggars in European travel literature might cause one to assume that begging was a perennial feature of the Jerusalem cityscape. Had this been the case, however, Isan, who spent all of his life in the old city, would not have devoted much attention to them in his diary. In fact, the war led to the disintegration of family life and created an army of beggars. As in many provincial capitals of the Ottoman Empire, the very poor were catered to by a chain of endowments known as takeya, which provided soup, not to be confused with takia. They were lying. But
served free lies every day.
They're allowed to lie. They're allowed to. Yeah, they can say whatever they want as long as it destroys the infidel. They made up that they had endowments. They were called takia. But anyway, yeah. Sorry, didn't get to sleep until late last night, so I'm a little bit, in that loopy mode. Anyway, the very poor were catered to by a chain of endowments known as takeya, which provided soup in kitchens and public food. In most neighborhoods, people took care of their own through confessional and kinship networks. With the onslaught of the war and the wide-scale absence of male breadwinners from poor families, the city experienced a breakdown of communal solidarities. The monthly salary of an Ottoman soldier was 85 piastres, hardly enough to buy his monthly consumption of tobacco. During the war, tobacco was a main staple of survival and a medium of exchange among soldiers. It became a hard-sought commodity in the black market. At least 12 entries in Isan's diary deal with the absence of cigarettes and the crisis it represented to soldiers and civilians alike. I feel like, Dimitri, you can relate to this, just imagine.
That's a line. They crossed the line.
Exactly. The absence of tobacco became a metaphor in all war diaries for the general deprivation imposed by the war. On Friday, April 23rd, 1915, Isan made the following entry. Nowhere can we find cigarettes. Everybody is complaining and missing their tutan, Arabo-Turkish rolling tobacco. We have been deprived already of sugar, kerosene, and rice, but these shortages have not had the same impact as the deprivation of tobacco. People in the city have given up on most items, but now, deprived of their smokes, they are attacking the government for getting involved in this war.
You know what? I mean, people like to make light about, treats and stuff like that. But, sometimes treats matter.
Yeah, treats certainly mattered here. Yeah, they were.
It was one thing when the rice and
the kerosene were gone. But when,
those cigarettes,
it was a fulcrum of world history here. Officers were given preference when new consignments of tobacco arrived, and they often supplemented their salaries by selling it to soldiers, especially if the shipment included choice brands from Istanbul, such as Samsun and Murad. Wow, I'm almost kind of wanting to try Ottoman cigarettes. Ottomans were it's actually interesting. In the Victorian era, it's kind of one of those things where talk about a short memory. People sort of forgot that cigarettes were bad for you. It was widely known back when it was a thing, a way to be racist against Ottomans. Yeah, people used to kind of have a set before sort of cigarette companies stepped in and everything, and it was more associated with being an Ottoman habit. People it was more widely known or widely appreciated that cigarettes were bad for you. But then once it's lost that sort of racist association, at least as I recall, people can fact check me. This is kind of an off the dome factoid, but I remember reading that, when I years ago when I was doing some research or something else.
That is interesting.
Yeah,
that is interesting. 'Cause there's tobacco, I guess Turkey and I guess Virginia, the American South were kind of the two. Maybe still to this day, or the two heavy hitters in terms of tobacco cultivation. But the attitudes definitely shifted radically over time. It's just how it used to be seen as totally unbecoming for women to smoke, and then Edward Bernays did a PR campaign for Lucky Strike during World War I.
Torches of Freedom.
Yeah, the Torches of Freedom was a World War I thing because he was doing propaganda for the U.S. government, and that's kind of where he cut his teeth in doing mass manipulation psyop campaigns. But yeah, then that's why the flapper era became cool for ladies to smoke, and stuff like that. It was seen as they feminist coded it, kind of like,
Yeah.
you know, so around the time of you know, women's suffrage and everything. Very interesting. And now today it's like representative of everything bad once again, and they're trying to ban it, which is sus. Anyways, yeah, that paints a very vivid picture. And also, nobody ever talks about like the famine in the region of Syria and Palestine during the war. Like I haven't read everything about it, but didn't they say that like more people died of famine than even like in military action or something?
I think so.
Or they had
That
the highest
sounds right.
civilian death toll of any belligerent in World War I. There was a remarkable statistic along those lines.
I don't know for sure, but based on this book, like it does seem like all of this stuff, like it just was like a complete social like breakdown and absolute nightmare. You know, that's not even the like tip. Like he goes on to talk about, with the economic collapse of many households, Jerusalem, like Damascus and Beirut, began to witness the emergence of a new institution: prostitution. The Ottoman military had introduced its own bordellos in the holy city to cater to soldiers. Wow. Several contemporary writings mention that the high officer corps, this story is like, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens later. Okay. The Ottoman military introduced its own bordellos in the holy city to cater to soldiers. Several contemporary writings mention that the high officer corps, as well as potentates and city notables, kept concubines. By the second year of the war, however, prostitution was widespread and serviced all categories of army personnel, most of whom were separated for months and years from their families and female companies. On the occasion of Sultan Muhammad Rashid's assumption to the throne on April 27, 1915, Cemal Pasha held a major party in the garden of the commissariat for the Ottoman high brass and local notables. 50 prostitutes were brought in from the city bordellos to accompany the officers, while the city notables brought in their wives. Istan expressed his shock at this mixing of prostitutes with respectable ladies, but also at the fact that this indulgence took place at the height of fighting in Janakkala, Gallipoli, where thousands of fellow soldiers, Arabs and Turks, were being slaughtered. Prostitution soon spread to the streets of the old city. To illustrate the depths of moral degeneration in the city, the diarist cites a case in which several well-known teachers from a public school in Baka were caught hosting local prostitutes in school during teaching hours. The Jerusalem governor had the 3 teachers, who included the religious instructor Sheikh Yaqub Asbaki, expelled from their positions. But former mayor Fayed Elami, then a member of parliament in Istanbul, intervened on their behalf, and their sentence was reduced to paying a fine of 50 kurs. Isan wrote in protest, teachers should first be professionals whose conduct, well, this is the original, like, you know, groomers. Yeah. He wrote in protest, teachers should first be professionals whose conduct is above reproach. And secondly, they should be equipped with knowledge and the training of children. In our case, thank God, both traits are lacking entirely. It is true that teachers are human beings and have needs to satisfy their basic desires, but they should exercise control. Wow. I mean, really, he's being pretty diplomatic about this. Like, it's true that, you know, they have needs,
they're having
but
sex parties in school.
yeah, but they should control their instincts, please. Like, you know, in all cases, they should never be allowed to bring women of easy virtue to their schools, where children are exposed to these practices and are given a bad example in ethical conduct. Many poor war widows in Isan's own neighborhood near Damascus Gate were seen selling their bodies for a few piastres. Isan met them daily on his way to work near the new gate. One evening, while he and his cousin Hassan were on their way to have dinner with Sakakini, he met a streetwalker loitering near the Austrian hospice. I said to Hassan, "This poor woman waiting for her deliverance," he said, "what can she do? She has to live. She makes a Majidi a trick to survive. What miserable creatures selling their bodies for pennies to satisfy the bestial needs of men. I am sure that most prostitutes would not practice their professions except for their financial need." Wow. Pretty
Excuse
swerf.
me. Whoa, swerf alert. Swerf alert.
Yeah. Wow.
I'm stopping recording now.
Sorry. This
violent.
beleaguered Arab Ottoman soldier living through absolute hell is canceled for expressing this swerf sentiment. Anyway.
Class-based critique of sex work.
Whoa.
Not in this space.
No place.
Not in this house.
This movement. Okay. Some may have enslaved themselves to men who promised them marriage and then deserted them. Oof. Isan expresses compassion for the Jerusalem prostitutes in terms of general compassion for Muslim women. He had read and admired Qasim Amin's call for women's emancipation, Tahrir al-Mar'a, in 1899, and expressed the belief that the general backwardness of Arab society was related to the confinement of women. He called for the removal of the veil and linked the struggle for women's rights to the fight against Turkish dictatorship of the CUP. The occasion for his comment, interesting, it's very interesting how like people have these different sort of takes. I guess, it's perennial, but the occasion for his comment was a Department of Education ban on the performance of dramatic shows in public schools that alluded to the heroism of classical Arab figures. In this case, a play about Tariq bin Zayed, the conqueror of Andalusia. We have entered into a compact with this Ottoman state that can only work if we are treated on equal footing with the Turkish subject. Now, however, the state has chosen to treat us as a colonized possession, and the time has come to break the partnership, he adds. Well, very perceptive, because that is kind of what happened. Yep. I spoke with Hilmi Effendi about the status of the Muslim woman. I told him that education is the key to her emancipation. I mentioned that the veil is an obstacle to her advancement, but it should not be removed all at once, as this would harm the movement to improve her condition. I said, how can we progress when half of our nation is ignorant? How can we live when half of our bodies are paralyzed? We need to teach her, then teach her, and teach her. Anyway, so, he continued to, express these views, but amidst this, the Syrian provinces were overwhelmed with, in a sense of impending catastrophe. He writes, the combination of war casualties and natural disasters produce a sense of atrophy among the civilian population. Our lives are threatened from all sides. A European war and an Ottoman war. Prices are skyrocketing. A financial crisis. And the locusts are attacking the country north and south.
I just want to hold up real quick. I just want to emphasize that this book is called Year of the Locust, and it sounds like a cool metaphorical title, but the reason they call it, there literally were biblical swarms of locusts. Yeah, there's a plague of locusts this year, which is definitely gives would make a lot of people kind of annoyed.
I mean, there are locust swarms. They happen in the desert. However, under these circumstances, it was absolutely devastating, and it was
there's some Dracularity to the locusts showing up when they did.
Oh, for sure, for sure. On top of all this, now infectious diseases are spreading throughout the Ottoman lands. May God protect us. Ultimately, his reaction to the accumulated catastrophes, like that of many Jerusalemites, was one of increasing indifference, almost a placidity, a response that is common to people seeking to shield themselves from impending doom. Usually I worry about the smallest matter that can happen to me, but now with disaster visiting everybody, I have stopped caring. Since this devastation has been heaped on our lives, we cannot focus on one single calamity. One disaster overwhelms the other. And when we think of all these misfortunes coming together, we stop caring at all. 1 year later, the situation got worse, with hunger setting in. Monday, July 10th, 1916. Jerusalem has not seen worse days. Bread and flour supplies have almost dried up. Every day I pass the bakeries on my way to work, and I see a large number of women going home empty-handed. For several days, the municipality distributed some kind of black bread to the poor, the likes of which I have never seen. People used to fight over the limited supply, sometimes waiting in line until midnight. Now, even that bread is no longer available. As the carnage,
that was the charity bread, I think, that the Orthodox churches would hand out. It was literally it was crappy charity bread that was called black bread. Yeah.
I guess it was apparently actually black, but as the carnage of war engulfed people's lives and Cemal Pasha escalated his measures against Arab nationalists, anti-Turkish sentiment increased. I mean, one can see why, especially when Cemal Pasha is hanging people.
I do want to get to that in a second and explain his little freak out that ends up lighting the powder keg kind of.
I mean, it really
along with these other things happening.
I mean, you can see why the confidence in the Ottoman government was not at an incredible high, overall, and why the critique of them as not upholding the Sharia, with all these quote unquote moral degeneration, was not
clearly come on, join our jihad. Also, come to my hooker party, it's not exactly
see why that was an effective critique, or valid critique, really. With the intensification of fighting in the Sinai Peninsula and Suez, more Jerusalem residents were either taken to the front or forced into labor battalions to undertake public work for the army. In September 1918, the Fourth Army issued a new order banning the stationing of soldiers in their own townships, an order that would have transferred Ihsan from his clerical work to the front in Suez. He wrote, "I cannot imagine myself fighting in the desert front, and why should I go? To fight for my country? I am Ottoman by name only, for my country is the whole of humanity. Even if I am told that by going to fight we will conquer Egypt, I will refuse to go." That is, liberating it from the British. The lofty ideas Ihsan expresses in his diary toward nationalism, the emancipation of women, the alleviation of poverty, especially his amorphous humanism, were born of his pre-war innocence and were unattached to any ideological commitment, whether socialist, nationalist, or religious. He was free from all ideational constraints, partly due to his lack of a rigorous educational background, but also, like Sakakini and Michael Naimi from the same generation, due to his naive belief in humanist concepts which were soon to be extinguished. But unlike the situation in Central and Western Europe, where the war ushered in the repressive apparatus of the modern nation-state, as well as the promise of social emancipation, the Syrian-Palestinian front opened up a different set of possibilities to Arab society. Instead of fostering internationalism, it gave rise to new nationalisms and an appetite for national self-determination. Instead of bringing social emancipation, it created a vivid experience of modernity, enhanced by the machinery of war, and the emergence of a mass society that undermined communal solidarities. The building blocks of society, the press, public education, and notions of citizenship, have been evolving in Europe over a century. But the experience of social emancipation and the emergence of a new national identity were intertwined only in concept. As we will see, they took place in the mind of the young soldier and his generation as separate life events. This is an interesting part that I thought, we'll move on like from this particular, this sort of summary of Ihsan's diary in a second. But this part is kind of interesting. The experience of new rhythms of daily life was at the heart of these modernities of war. We have seen that the war created a new sense of time, discreteness, and geography, the decentering of Palestine within the imperial domain, increased people's mobility through the advent of the railroad and the automobile, introduced greater discipline in military work, and conquered the night through electrification and the positioning of guards in the streets outside the city walls. As a result, people in the city began to socialize and entertain themselves in the evening. Ihsan's diary refers to daily incursions into the municipal park in Manshiyeh on Jaffa Road, where Ottoman military bands entertained the public. Yaakov Yeshua, father of Hebrew writer A.B. Yehoshua, wrote in Jerusalem of the old days, Yerushalayim Tamol Shilshom. The army band played there twice a week, conducted by a person called Kowalski, who had a music instrument shop. In the same period, Vasif Jauheria, the musician, also described Manshia as a major place of entertainment in the city. His father, Girgis, had a concession for a cafe there, where Wasif and his brother played their ouds. The place was particularly popular among soldiers. This new sense of mobility meant that people's work and social networks began to extend beyond their townships. In discussing his marriage plans, almost towards the end of the year, Ihsan contemplates finding a partner outside Jerusalem, a possibility that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Mass circulating newspapers and popular books were also new developments during the war. Papers were read aloud in public cafes for those who were illiterate or could not afford them. In Palestine, as in Syria and Egypt, the daily press already existed, of course, but the war enhanced newspaper circulation because people were hungry for news from the war front, Iraq, Suez, the Dardanelles, where their family members were stationed. Ihsan's diary reflects the obsessions of a young soldier with the care of his body and its ailments. Again, he displays the strong influences of Al-Dusturia College, which offered physical training classes as part of the core curriculum. Muhammad Salih's Raudat al-Ma'arif introduced similar paramilitary classes. Sakakini was famous in his circle for his regimen of daily cold showers and rigorous physical training, and Ihsan sought to follow his mentor in this practice. Amateur wrestling was one of Sakakini's favorite pastimes, so maybe they are Bronze Age. Maybe Palestinians, are, despite some aspersions that have been cast, in which he engaged many of his students and fellow teachers. Ihsan himself was a mild hypochondriac, examining his body daily for symptoms of disease and expressing fear of catching one of the main epidemics that ravaged Palestine during the war: malaria, cholera, and typhus. Many of his comrades and acquaintances died from the latter two diseases. For a provincial Ottoman city, Jerusalem was well equipped with medical facilities and services. Both government clinics and mission hospitals gave Palestinians a wide choice of medical services. Two of Ihsan's cousins, Hassan and Hussein Khalidi, were newly trained doctors serving as medical officers in the Jerusalem area. His neighbor Rustum Effendi was an Agzakhani pharmacist and played a big role in Ihsan's crisis at the end of his life. Another doctor, Tawfiq Kanan, the famous dermatologist and ethnographer from Beit Jala, was the director of Jerusalem's military hospital and also a family friend. Ihsan often used his services to acquire medical leaves from army duty, and Kanan was apparently happy to oblige. When Ihsan discovered a rash on his genitals one day, Hassan, his cousin, examined him and informed him that it was probably a venereal infection. el-Efranji, the Frankish disease. His son went into panic. He protested using the same language attributed to the Virgin Mary when she was informed by the angel of the Lord that she was bearing a child. I was not touched by a human being. Lam yamesani basbaran. Basharan. I was like, basbaran. Well, anyway, when Dr. Khalid suggested that perhaps the rash came from association with soldiers, Hussein threatened to commit suicide.
Wow.
He was particularly concerned that catching any disease, this gets so dark. He was particularly concerned that catching any disease would jeopardize his future chances with his beloved Sureya, the woman he intended to marry. Eventually, the rash disappeared and he was restored to sanity. Contemporary observations indicate that homosexuality was widely practiced in the Jerusalem garrison, as in the ranks of the armed forces worldwide. Hussein was shocked when one of his commanders, an Albanian officer, took a sudden fondness for him and pursued him relentlessly. He recorded in his diary that the officer wrote to him incessant letters expressing his affection and desire to play with his hair and kiss me between the eyes. Whoa. When Hussein rebuffed the man, the Albanian resorted to threats and became abusive. He began to visit Hussein at his home late at night and threatened to kill him unless he yielded. Finally, in desperation, Hussein hesitantly reported the abusive captain to his commander, Rushen Bey, also an Albanian. He was afraid of the man's retribution. At this juncture, the diary abruptly ends. The episode casts dark shadows on the causes of Turjman's death, since we know from family sources that he was killed by an Ottoman soldier just before Allenby troops entered Jerusalem in December 1917.
Jesus. Oh, that's dark. Yeah.
That's really dark.
Wow.
Like, that's the hell. That's just an example of, like, the insane shit that was going on, like, in the life of, like, the average, like, Arab soldier in the Ottoman army. You know, like, locusts were attacking. You were eating black bread. There were no cigarettes. Meanwhile, like, Cemal Pasha is, like, cavorting around with prostitutes while everyone is being slaughtered in Gallipoli. And, like, your Albanian commander is, like, trying to rape you. And then, like, murders you for refusing to yield.
Jesus Christ. I mean, that's pretty dark. Yeah. Not exactly easy times to live through.
I mean, it does kind of put something in context, though. These same people were saying, like, and then when the British arrived, like, they had a level of depravity that we could not conceive of.
I mean, Jesus. Well,
what?
You know,
all right, okay.
Anybody who's traveled abroad knows that ranking kind of like who are the biggest wild, like, pervs is probably like, like the Germans and the French and then like the British or the whole other level. So I just want to swing back in and check in on Cemal Pasha, the governor of Syria during the war, and his own his schizo mode kind of phase that he goes into as described by Antonius. So I'll just read a little bit here from the revolt chapter. He writes that Cemal had made a point, as we have seen, of trying to win the Syrian population, and more particularly the Muslims, over to a wholehearted participation in the war which he declared, and perhaps held, to be a war in defense of Islam. Kind of funny in light of what you just read. His immediate task on taking over the command of the Fourth Army had been to organize the attack on Egypt, and as the troops at his disposal were mainly Arab, he had thought it prudent to avoid giving them any grounds for disaffection. He had arrived in Syria knowing little or nothing of the existence of secret nationalist societies, and upon being shown the documents seized in the French consulates at Beirut and Damascus, had decided to ignore them, especially as the incriminated persons included Muslims of standing. The only political prosecution he had approved was that of Nakla Mutran Pasha, a well-known Christian, who was found guilty of trying to enlist the support of the French consul in a scheme for the annexation of Baalbek to the Lebanon, sentenced to exile for life, exhibited in the streets of Damascus, and who subsequently died, not without state assistance, on his way to exile. When the Egyptian campaign had failed, largely owing to Cemal's miscalculations, he had returned from the Sinai front inwardly humiliated and, as is usual with frustrated mediocrity, shorter in the temper. Papers were placed before him incriminating one Yusuf Hayek, a Maronite priest from the Lebanon, with having exchanged treasonable correspondence with M. Deschanel, then president of the French Chamber. Cemal signed the death warrant unhesitatingly, and the unfortunate priest, who was a fervent Francophile, was publicly hanged in Damascus, and this is March 1915. Then, gradually, reports came in, with an increasing tale of proof of underground nationalist activities, that the army was honeycombed with revolutionary cells, that England and France had agents in the country to provoke a revolt, that an Allied landing on the Syrian coast was impending, that Arab officers in the army had promised to abet the landing. Military intelligence is seldom at its best in following up political clues, and the general staff of the Fourth Army was no exception. While it had an ear for rumors, its nose failed to pick their scent. The information was substantially true, but it could not be traced home to any of the plotters, and Cemal was disturbed by it and made anxious and vindictive but bewildered. Like Polyphemus, he wanted to strike but did not know at whom. Just then, in June 1915, Enver asked him to release troops for the Gallipoli front, and he sent the 25th Division, which was entirely Arab and formed one of the mainstays of al-Ad's plans for a revolt. Subsequently, whenever an opportunity arose, he would displace Arab units from Syria and replace them by battalions manned by Turks. Then, turning to civilian organizations, he decided to prosecute the persons incriminated in the documents seized at the French consulates. A large number of people were arrested, brought before a military court of sinister fame at Alais in the Lebanon, interrogated, tortured, and tried. 13 of those were sentenced to death, 45 others who were abroad or had escaped to the same sentence in absence, and a number to varying terms of imprisonment and deportation. All of them men of standing, and some of them personalities famed throughout the Arab world. Of the 13 who were present to hear their death sentence, 2 were reprieved, and the rest executed at the dawn of August 21st, 1915. 11 gallows had been erected in Beirut's principal square, which, strangely enough, went by the name of Liberty Square. 10 of the victims were Muslims, the other a Christian. They all came from different parts of Syria, Beirut, Baalbek, Hama, Damascus, Jenin, and most of them were young and died well, leaving it to their horror-stricken compatriots to exalt their last words at the gallows into a stirring message of patriotic faith. Amongst them was Mohammed Mihmesani, a brilliant graduate of the School of Law in Paris, and one of the founders of Al-Fatah, who, regardless of torture and of offers of pardon in return for a confession, died without divulging the existence of the society. So basically, he kills all of these. Well, he says, thus had begun Cemal Pasha's new Arab policy, a modest beginning in relation to what was to come. So it intensified from there. So when Faisal came back to Damascus after this shift, he found conditions changed beyond recognition. He had come with the settled purpose of fomenting a revolt of the Arab divisions in the Turkish army and a mass rising of the population on a signal from his father. And accompanying him were a picked retinue of some 40 determined men, several of them members of the Sharif's clan, who were to form his personal bodyguard and who, like him, were carrying their life in their hands. To Cemal, he justified their presence by representing them as an advance guard of the force which the Sharif had been asked to raise in the Hejaz, and the pretext had been taken at its face value and welcomed. Banquets and receptions were held in his honor and in celebration of the arrival of the advance guard. But when the festivities were over and Faisal had had time to look around and take stock, he found himself in the strangest surroundings. The last remaining Arab divisions had been transferred, with most of his friends from Al-Ad, and their place taken by battalions manned by Turks. Prominent civilians had been deported by the hundreds to distant places in Anatolia. The famine, which was afterwards to take an appalling toll of lives, had already begun, and the population, impoverished by army requisitions, currency depreciation, and shortage of food, were mainly preoccupied with their fight against hunger. It added to the general apprehension that another and larger batch of Muslim and Christian notables had been arrested on charges of treason and were awaiting their trial at Alais. Among these were some of the best-known and most influential names in Syria, whose arrest seemed to show that Cemal had done with his tactics of politic forbearance. The trial lasted several months and was conducted with calculated severity to the accompaniment and minatory ill-treatment and torture. The Sharif Hussein intervened with telegrams to Cemal, to the Grand Vizier, and to the Sultan, urging that if any of the accused were found guilty, punishment be limited to life sentences. Otherwise, added Hussein darkly, blood will cry for blood. Faisal pleaded with Cemal in person, but their intervention was in vain. So the first person killed was Joseph Hani, a well-known Christian resident of Beirut. A month later, 21 others were similarly killed, 7 in Damascus, 14 in Beirut, including Senator Abdul Hamid al-Zahrawi of Homs, who presided over the Arab Congress in Paris, and a lot of other notable people, like basically wiping out like kind of the leading like local ruling class and political ruling class of Syria.
Yeah.
I think he even did some kind of like sicko shit where he kind of acted like they were all going to be like released or transferred because they didn't announce the death sentences. But on the eve of the execution, a gaoler had entered the hall of the prison and read out the names of 21 of the accused, bidding them dress and follow him. Those for Damascus were taken by train, and on arrival there, marched to the Marge, the main square, where 7 gallows stood in readiness. The others were driven down to Beirut in carriages, and guessing their fate, whiled the hours of darkness away with hymns to Arab freedom, one cabload answering another until, as dawn was breaking, the convoy came to a halt in Liberty Square. By 6 o'clock that morning, the 6th of May, the Holocaust was over, and within 2 hours a special number of Al-Sharq was being distributed free, in which the charges, the trials, the sentences, and the executions were announced in the same breath. The charges were defined as, quote, treasonable participation in activities of which the aims were to separate Syria, Palestine, and Iraq from the Ottoman Sultanate and to constitute them into an independent state. A shudder shook the country. No one, even among those who knew the savagery latent in Jamal's nature, had expected such severity. The sentences were all the more appalling as they had fallen on innocent and guilty alike, since many of the victims were known to have kept aloof from anything approaching treason. On the population at large, the immediate effect was one of terror. The few leaders who had remained undetected were horror-stricken. Not in their wildest moments of apprehension had they imagined such a toll of their confederates, and, realizing their own powerlessness, they turned with heavy hearts to the contemplation of their strangled liberties and to the task of securing freedom, no longer for its own sake alone, but as a means of vengeance as well. Faisal was deeply affected. He had gone beyond the bounds of prudence in pleading with Jamal for the lives of the Arab patriots. Whatever doubts may have lingered in his mind as to the wisdom of breaking with the Turks were now swept away in a passionate revulsion of feeling, and the cry which escaped him on hearing the news of the executions became the battle cry of the Arab revolt. Yeah. So that
it's very interesting. You can really see this play out in this diary. Like, it's interesting to read, the same one that we've been discussing by Turjman. Yeah, and I mean, there's sense of like kind of impending doom, the idea that like this is all falling apart. It's even, I think we talked about this a little bit before we were recording, like how he uses like 3 dating systems. Like you can see like the sort of like chaos and the discord like that is just like like the epistemological breakdown. Like he uses like he's like Jerusalem, Sunday, March 28th, 1915, Gregorian. 15th of March, 1331, Ottoman fiscal. 1st Jamadi Awal, 1333, Hijri. Like, he's just like this weird Ottoman fiscal calendar they have to use
around like the modernity and the tradition. It's all just
but it's interesting that he says, like, what will be the fate of Palestine? We all saw 2 possibilities, independence or annexation to Egypt. The last possibility is more likely since only the English are likely to possess the country, and England is unlikely to give full sovereignty to Palestine, but is more liable to annex it to Egypt and create a single dominion ruled by the Khedive of Egypt. Neither will have it, unfortunately. Yeah. But and he talks about the hanging of soldiers at the Jaffa Gate on March 30th, 1915. He says, on my way to the commissariat this morning, I met Uncle Syed Eddin Effendi Khalili. He asked me if I had heard about the hanging of 2 soldiers at Jaffa Gate. They were sentenced to death by hanging. It is claimed because they deserted their company. What is a soldier supposed to do? The army pays its soldier 35 piastres a month and expected him to survive on it. Even then, most soldiers have not been paid 1 metlik since the general call, November 1914.
Damn.
Some people claim these poor sods were hanged because the Ottoman authorities believed they were passing on military secrets to the British. If the British government needed military information, do you think they would rely on such common folks on the Awam? These soldiers can hardly write their names. How are we to believe the army? So it's interesting that this is like, it wasn't just like, obviously these societies that exist and they were influential in Syria, but it wasn't just like that they were actually getting, everybody who was in these secret societies, because like, right, it was also just like
sweeps.
Random killing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Saying like the mixing, I guess that was part of what was so horrific about it was just sort of the wholesale like mixing up of people who had made a point of staying aloof from intrigues, and then people who actually were involved. It was like the ultimate like fake Epstein client list, like, but actually like QAnon hangs them all in like a public square, and it's like you just hanged Eminem. Like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? Like in 2025 when Trump brings in Q. Or Michael Flynn is unmasked.
When the
finally.
storm finally
When the
comes,
storm finally
yeah.
comes, and like Eminem and Spielberg and Tom Hanks and
I mean, it's not
fake
even
Mark
that.
Collins director.
It's honestly like, if like the Capitol Police like are just like being hanged or whatever for I don't know, like just like random people. I mean, American cops kind of
Arab
suck.
nationalists,
Like
the Epstein network at all, but
Yeah, no, but that's the thing. Like, it's, I guess not good. That would be the comparison. You're right. Like, this would be, but it was like the perception that, like, just like some random person who doesn't, I guess, not to defend American cops in this way either. It's kind of a tortured metaphor. However, like, it's just kind of like random people who, like, really have very limited options in like terms of like survival and like are just being like assumed to be like, betrayers or like stabbers in the back when it's not even how things are on like this. Yeah, the whole kind of like paranoid breakdown of the Ottoman state, like it really comes through,
and it ironically potentiates the very thing that it was like intending to stamp out. Like it forces, it forces the Arabs in Syria and Palestine and everything to basically. Actually, it's interesting how quickly sort of the Ottoman like CUP leadership kind of fumbles the bag, where you have 4 centuries of like there's always some tension between the province and the center and everything, but the deterioration of Ottoman identity in Syria and Palestine, like actually it accelerates like exponentially during this period, and just like kind of all at once, like it's liquidated, in the course of like a few years. And to a large, I mean, there's both outside forces prevailing upon it, but also like the mismanagement of like the Ottoman leadership and Cemal Pasha to kind of steer the ship in. He ends up just steering it in a very disastrous direction that almost makes it inevitable that people are going to feel forced to break away, and also, not identify it, as kind of happened to some extent. I mean, you could look at it in the Russian Empire too. They ended up having this like existential sort of liquidation of their fighting force, like through the February and then the Bolshevik Revolution, and then of course the extinguishing of like Austria-Hungary and the German Empire after the war. Like World War I was a graveyard of empires, right? And this is a moment where, amidst all of this extreme high pressure, and it is true that, like, just because they're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you, that there were absolutely, like, French and English intrigues, like, at play in this region, and they were absolutely plotting something, but, like Polyphemus, he was striking blindly, the Cyclops with a poked-out eye. He just didn't know who to strike against, and then it ends up catalyzing the like Arab revolt proper.
Yeah,
and,
this is sorry.
No, go ahead.
This is an interesting episode. Right after you're talking about how there was a locust tax that was basically imposed on them. The government issued a new regulation for the locust campaign. Rich people now have to pay 1 Ottoman pound. Those with middle income pay 60 piasters, and poor people pay 30 piasters. I think the authorities did well with this edict, even though I hate them, by spreading the responsibility of collecting locust eggs on everybody and giving the option of payment to those who do not choose to collect. For the locusts do not discriminate between rich and poor. But the authorities forgot to provide for the lodging and feeding of the people who decide to get involved in this campaign. He talks about his aunt's illness. Then he goes on in this part, the shameful behavior of our officers. These 2 episodes that are back to back are pretty interesting. I was told by a friend who arrived today from Jaffa that an American ship docked at the port with a shipment of rice and sugar and other supplies for distribution to the civilian population. The Ottoman authority was negotiating for half of the material to be distributed to the civilian population and the other half to the military forces. The captain of the ship refused this and threatened to leave the port. Now I am told the debate is over how much customs his ship should pay. My friend told me that Cemal Pasha sent a memo to the chief of excise in Jaffa ordering him not to levy any customs on the ship. It turns out this shipment was sent from American Jews and non-Jews with the proviso that 2/3 of the foodstuff be distributed to the Israelites and the remaining third to other citizens. I am not sure why the English allowed this shipment to get through. The future is bound to uncover this secret. Both Cemal Pasha and both Cemal Pasha and Jamal the Little were invited for a dinner at the commissariat. The cost, I am told, was over 30 Ottoman pounds. Yesterday, HQ sent several military vehicles to La Trun to bring alcoholic drinks. More than 100 officers were invited, and the military band played through the meal. It's hard to take seriously Cemal Pasha's claim to devotion to Islam and of wanting to liberate Muslims from the British yoke. Every day we read a circular warning soldiers and officers against frequenting cafes and beer halls upon threat of imprisonment and expulsion from service. All this while the commanders are swimming in debauchery and drunkenness. At about 5 this evening, 2 battalions marched in front of the commissariat. What a pitiful sight. Young men, tall and well-built, but totally exhausted from their horrific experience at the front. They were wearing rags, many of them limping and wearing one shoe or no shoes. Most members of the 2 battalions were Turks who had just arrived from Abin, the ultimate hellhole of human misery. And they were supposed to liberate Egypt? He goes on. The shooting of Cemal Pasha and his entourage the same day. Hassan Khalidi came to visit around sunset. We went out for a stroll. He told me the following story. When Cemal Pasha and his entourage were driving from Gaza to Khan Yunis, names we hear in the headlines a lot, they were shot at from the direction of the British fleet at sea. Cemal Pasha, our great leader, the liberator of Egypt, that is to say, our leader toward the abyss of destruction, lost his mind. He kept shouting, "There is a spy among you who informed the British, and I was passing from here!" 3 exclamation points. After dinner, Hassan and I went to visit Professor Khalil Effendi Sakakini. We met there with Sheikh Abdul Qadir Mughrabi, Isaf Nashibi, Kilmi Husseini, Haj Amin Husseini, and Ishaq Effendi Darwish. Our talk was almost exclusively about the constitutional movement. Sheikh Mughrabi told us about his prison days. Then we discussed the works of the late Sheikh Muhammad Abdul and the works of Qasim Amin. We all felt the loss of these 2 great authors. Today, most shops were closed since most people were out collecting locust eggs. I did not go to the commissariat this evening, but stayed instead in the professor's house until 10 p.m. We heard that HQ will start mobilizing those born in the years 1310, 1311, and 1312. That is Hijri, I assume. Or Ottoman fiscal. I don't know. God have mercy on us. They must have gone mad. I went home at 11 and slept in undisturbed sleep. So there you go. That's
really
that's
underlying
the
vibes I was getting that when we started talking about World War I, that it was like a satanic like mass sacrifice, like war, like, Astroworld times a million. But really like just like the misery and like the collapse and like the unleashing of like all of the sort of like worst forces in human nature that spread like a virus throughout World War I, like destabilizing, liquefying kind of everything, liquidating all meaning. It's like a horror movie. Like I'm just thinking about like the creepy visual of like everyone going out to like collect locust eggs, like we gotta fight the locust pandemic, guys. Like I mean, I guess but it's like it's like creepy. I don't know.
It is like because it's not what you imagine when you imagine war, which is like just constant battling and like total like bombardment. Basically what's happening in Gaza right now. That's like kind of what you picture, just like endless misery, but it's almost kind of like the average day in Palestine for the last 70 years where, it's just kind of like this weird like stillness and misery, like that, where you can still like be like worried about like your crush or whatever, but also like you're under the thumb of like a psycho. Your commander's trying to rape you and no one will do anything about it. You had to collect locust eggs while not wearing shoes. And like there's just this constant sense of impending doom. Like
it kind of starts here and arguably doesn't really stop up to the present day. Like this is the long Nakba. The beginning of the long Nakba, essentially, for Palestine in particular. These diaries do paint a very robust, spooky picture of the reality. I guess we're sort of at our time, but I think that's a good place to pause. There's a lot going on in World War I guess next time we can jump directly into like the popping off the Arab Revolt. Finally talk a little bit more, maybe a little more about T.E. Lawrence and like his role in the whole thing, and even kind of like the meta on top of Lawrence and like
Yeah.
you know what he represents to like the Western mind, and then get into like Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and like the denouement of World War One and the establishment of the Mandate. You know, because there's a lot of very fascinating intrigues. Like once the Arab Revolt pops off, and after
I mean,
all
like
these,
the Balfour Declaration, Sykes-Picot, like all that stuff. Yeah, like it really is like a major bridge to like the Mandate, which is its own like sort of sus period. It's interesting that like we were originally thinking we were gonna do like what, like 2 episodes like on Ottoman Palestine and the Mandate, and it's like I mean. Yeah, I don't know how many we're gonna do on World War One, but like it's a huge thing. And you were even wanting to go like beyond the Mandate to talk about like World War II a little bit or and stuff.
I mean,
like
I always
that.
write that down, but then it becomes clear when we start that like there's a lot to chew on.
Well, I mean, like eventually.
Definitely.
Yeah, so
eventually.
we don't know how this will take.
I don't know when. I don't know when we're gonna terminate the kind of the timeline. Because now I mean, I'm inevitably very fascinated now on kind of the post 1948. Politics and all that stuff, which again, it's like I'm vaguely familiar with like the history of it, but I'd really like to get as deeply into it as we've gotten into the earlier period of history, because there's not that long of a line of succession between the forces that sort of coalesce in this period and names that we're way more familiar with in the 20th century. I mean, we will circle around because the Zionists, we didn't really talk so much about the Zionists like yet in the World War I thing. They kind of pop in near the end in a surprising like twist, and like there's almost so much horror going on in the Ottoman Empire like during the war that it's almost like people like kind of forget for a minute that they have a lot to like focus on, and then boom, the Balfour Declaration drops, and but we will get kind of back. I mean, because I'm pretty sure at this point like young David Ben Gurion is like a boy or a young man. I have to check his birth date, but people that'll become like prime ministers of Israel are alive.
He was a boy.
Point.
He was actually pretty old.
Yeah.
He was already like was he 30? Damn.
Wow. Interesting.
What?
Okay.
Yeah, he was born in 1886. So
wow. Okay. So and then I guess he did live to be pretty
old.
old.
So I guess he was 10 in 1896, and then 20 in 1990.
And he moved
in
from
1906, and then
Eastern. Did he move from Poland or Russian Poland to?
He was born in Plonsk.
In Poland. Okay, Russian Poland, I guess.
Plonsk.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, it's got a lot of little.
Is it an L with a slash through it?
L with a slash, and then an N
Plonsk.
with an accent a gu
Plonsk.
or.
Like Plonsk, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, and then he moved like early in the kind of like I think
in 1906. So he was
like labor
there.
Zionist like right after Herzl kind of blew up, changed the game.
Yeah, he was like one of the Jews who was begging like Turjman for like stuff at the commissariat.
Really?
Well,
wow.
he didn't say like I saw David Ben Gurion, but he had
like
immigrated to Palestine at that point.
Yeah. So he was around during this whole time.
Yeah.
By the way, like Turjman is his name.
Yeah.
I just find it interesting that it's so phonetically similar to Franjo Tudjman, the Ustaše revanchist Croatian leader in the 90s, who is very like Croatian Catholic, but those names seem like so weirdly similar that I wonder if there's like a Bosnian like connection, like Ottoman connection thing going. It would be funny if Tudjman was like part Turkish because he was like basically a Nazi, who's like all about like the purity of like the Croatian race, but like, very Slava Hrvatsky kind of shit. But it would be funny just as like an own on him that if he was like part Turkish. But regardless,
I'm not sure like where,
because it doesn't sound like an Arab surname.
I think it is.
To be fair, Tudjman doesn't sound like a typical Croatian last name either. So I'm not sure where it comes from.
My Arabic keyboard on my computer is like being is this like related to the word for translating? Yeah, that's like the first thing that I think of, but I might be. I'm not sure exactly what the last name means, but yeah, it's definitely an Arab name. Like Turjim is like placing a tombstone on a grave. And like it kind of had like the root has like a sense of like throwing like a rajim, like, you know, Adibullahi min shaitana regime. Like that's like sort of the stoned, right? The stoned Satan. I think it might have something to do with like, you know, maybe Turjman. Let me see. See article. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I'm looking at it in lanes to try to figure out the etymology, and it's actually a 4-character root according to Lane, which is pretty unusual. I mean, these Orientals are good for something. Yeah, it does have to do with the word for translation. Yeah, so Turjman, I assume, would be like a translator. Yeah, or an interpreter.
Yeah, interesting.
I was wondering, like, because usually words in Arabic are based on like 3-letter roots, so I assumed that there was some kind of connection between the word for translation and translator and the rajim meme root. But I guess that there isn't, and that it's like an independent thing in some way. Or maybe there is. I don't know. Maybe this is just Lane's. But this is usually based on Arab dictionaries, so, you know, there must be some precedent for considering this to be separate from the RJM root.
Oh, I guess I'm seeing on Quora now that somebody said, why do so many Croats have Germanic-sounding last names? They end in man, but have no obvious Germanic root, like Tujman, Osman, Kajoman. Or I guess they're saying that, like, Tujman does not have an obvious German root. It's not like Weissmann or something like that, you know. But I'm not sure if they're saying that, like, Tujman, like, is German derived, or if it's like an unusual thing, and if like maybe. That's
I mean,
like
a lot of names end in mon, like, you know, there's a lot of people, like, I don't know, I can't think of one now, but I'm sure anyone listening can think of, like, a random name that ends in mon. But in this case, it's totally different. It's just, well, an is like al-Rahman, you know, like, an is like kind of a common, agental suffix in Arabic. So in this case, the mon and the doesn't have anything to do with, like, you know, the sort of suffix mon that you see a lot of the time, like, you know, in random names, like, I don't know, Heinemann or whatever.
Somebody writes here that this person asked
the Heisman
well,
trophy.
look at the. They say that they're confusing the Germanic man with 2 n's suffix with the Turkish man/men suffix, which basically means person who does. And the example they give is Tujman is actually derivative from Turkish, which means like foreign man, like a foreign person.
Interesting.
Like tuj,
well, I bet that the Turkish prefix man, if it's agental in that same way, probably has some relationship to the Arabic.
Yeah. So I mean,
but
so
it's not because man, the M doesn't have. It might be a coincidence, but the M isn't part of the. Like, you know, you can have a Rahman. I mean, that's a bad example because it does have an M, but you can have all sorts of an suffix words that in Arabic it's the an that does it, not the not the M. But
yeah, they say the other examples they give are Osman for Ottoman and Kocaman for harvester, like person who scythes the field. So I guess Tujman. I mean, that's just funny.
So
that
maybe
like Tujman's like basically literally like a white supremacist, like weird Nazi Croat who's like all about like being like Western, like Bronze Age Western civilization, like blah blah blah. But like his name is like kind of a Turkish name. You know,
there you go.
So maybe maybe that's where he got his complex from. Basically, he's like has to be more Croat than any other Croat. Just spitballing, but that I clocked that. I'm like, huh, yeah. So maybe like a Torjman, I don't know. I guess could mean something else, or could be driven from the Turkish for
he
like
wanted
foreign
to,
man.
Eliminate ethnically cleansed Bosnian Muslims.
Oh yeah.
And yet,
I'm about to get to Tujman. A whole thing in Demon Forces about Tujman, great friend of the United States government and Ambassador Peter Galbraith. There's a lot going. He's pretty sus. Like he's extremely. He doesn't get enough shit, and he's very sus. Is all I'll say right now. But anyways, yeah. Right. I guess we can stop right there for now. We'll jump back into like kind of the. Like the climactic phase of World War I and the Great T.E. Lawrence and the Arab Revolt, and then the series of great betrayals that just like one after another just keep on coming, and of course like the surprising like, you know, Zionist theme music starts playing and they come out with a steel chair and like hit the Arabs on that, like, you know, in pro wrestling parlance. It's like a shocking moment where they kind of re-enter the stage and And yeah, we'll talk about like Chaim Weissman and his meetings with Faisal, and also like something that surprised me, like actually like a not insignificant amount of opposition to Balfour from like English Jews who were not down with it, including the only Jewish member, I think, of like the British cabinet at the time, whose name is escaping me right now, but was actually fiercely against it, whereas all the Protestants were they got converted. They saw the light, basically. They became dreamers. So yeah, we'll pick up with that next time. But until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.